So I've been watching uh, David Simon's The Deuce, and I have really mixed feelings about it. David Simon is one of the best filmmakers around, or best TV producers around. He did The Wire, which was many people call the best TV series ever. I thought it was really good. There were some moments that I didn't like so much, but I thought it was really good. And I hesitated for years to watch The Deuce because it's about the rise of pornography in the 70s. And I didn't know if I needed to watch multiple episodes fixating on women's degradation. And also, some of my problems with The Wire were there were scenes where uh, the misogyny of the culture really shines through in an unexamined way. And there are some writers I don't really trust in terms of misogyny, and David Simon's one of them. And so I didn't trust that he would do a good job of examining this issue. And there are parts that are really good. He does a wonderful job of showing the violence that is necessary to underlie women's degradation in this way, and the violence, the control. There are some wonderful speeches by some of the characters about, I don't control anything of myself. There is nothing that belongs to me. Everything belongs to, in this case, her pimp. And she is literally sold by her pimp to the mafia when she moves from street prostitution to pornography. And so there are some really good, powerful scenes along those lines. And there are also places where David Simon, I think, could have used what we can call a native informant. And that's really going to be the point of this, not so much The Deuce as it is a problem that I experienced too as a writer, and we'll get to that in a minute. But a couple of the examples of this in The Deuce, there was a scene where two women who are opposed to prostitution and pornography and trying to help women are arguing about what was at the time the movement to ban pornography. And one is arguing that this pornography is, I mean, who is hurt by the banning of pornography? It is the pornographers. It's not the women. It's not, and the other woman is arguing, but we have a First Amendment and this is free speech. And what you're talking about is censorship. And the other woman responds, well, but we're censoring smut. We're not censoring good ideas. And he says, well, but where do you draw the line? That's where they get into. And that's not the argument that was made, and that's not the real argument to make. The real argument to make is we're not talking about words on a piece of paper. We're talking about men's free speech written on the bodies of women. We're talking about real women who are being sexually assaulted. We're talking about real women who are being degraded. This is not speech. This is action. And banning an action is not the same as banning speech. That's the argument that should have been made, but was not. And the real point is that 15 minutes of conversation with a native informant, 15 minutes of conversation with one of the women who made those arguments they could have changed it with 2 lines of dialogue and they would have got it perfect. And there's another scene later where, and this is what sparked me to do this particular video, there was another scene later where a character who is really sort of representing the liberal feminist perspective, she makes she makes feminist porn, she calls it. So she's sort of, this is in the 80s, and she's a precursor to the queer movement. And at one point she has this long speech about how morality is a means to enforce normality. I mean, yeah, it's just a means to enforce social behavior, and morality is meaningless. And in the discussion after, about the making of this episode, David Simon says, well, my sister said that years ago, and it always stuck with me, and I wanted to put that in the character's mouth. And that's all fine, that's all great. But I wish you would have talked to me. I wish you would have talked to Charlene Spretnak, because yes, morality is used to control people, but that doesn't mean that there is no morality. What that is that's fundamentally the queer theorist and the postmodern and queer theorist position, that all we have are these discourses, and the discourses are inherently oppressive and they try to control you, and that's great. He has a character making that argument, but there wasn't the rebuttal to the argument that should have been made. And Charlene Spretnak was the one who really turned me on to the rebuttal of this argument decades ago, when she addressed the postmodern idea that there is no such thing as morality by holding up a glass of water and saying, we are bodies, we are embodied beings, and if you don't have drinkable quantities of clean water, you die. Drinkable quantities of clean water are moral. Poisoning water is immoral, because we have bodies, and then you can build up a morality from there. So if David Simon would have asked me, I would have said that. And then I would also have said, David, do you agree that it is immoral to rape an infant? And one would hope that he would say yes. And if he said yes, then I would say, great, because now we can have a reasonable discussion about the ways in which morality does and does not control people, and the ways in which there is no such thing as inherent morality. Because if you believe it's immoral to rape an infant, then we agree that there is such a thing as morality, and everything at that point becomes then a social discussion and negotiation of what we as a society believe is moral and what we believe is immoral, as opposed to immorality all being, or morality all being imposed by discourses that have no grounding whatsoever. So then we get to the point of this discussion, which is that I don't blame David Simon for this, because he has spent his life learning how to make really, really good dramas. That is a skill that takes a lifetime to do. He has not spent years thinking about the grounding of morality as I have. I've spent years thinking about this, just like Lear Keith, who was the one who gave me the argument about it is written, the pornography is written on the bodies of women, and Andrea Dworkin did before that. They spent decades honing those arguments. They did not spend years and decades learning how to make really good film. And you can't do it all. There's only so much time. And this is a problem I see. I run into this myself. There are times when I write something and I do my research the best I can, just as David Simon did the research the best he could. But I don't know what it's like. I mean, if I wrote, I'm sure at some point I've written something about football, but I don't know what it's like to be a football player. All I can do is go from the outside, and then when possible have an insider informant. Another example of this was 12 Monkeys, which is a movie I liked quite a lot in the 90s, but there was a big problem with it I had, which is at one point, animal rights activists release snakes into the halls of Congress to make the point that politicians are snakes. And when I was watching it, that just struck me as false immediately, because A, animal rights activists would not insult snakes in that way. They would actually admire snakes. And B, they would never release snakes into the halls of Congress because those snakes are going to get killed. Sure, there have been times animal rights activists have released animals not into their native territory and they have been killed, but they would never intentionally put them in a place where they will get stepped on. Never happened. that could have been solved with 10 minutes of a conversation with an animal rights activist. What's my point? My point is that we know what we know, we have the skills that we have, and it can be I see this so often. I see this in journalism quite often. I first recognized this in journalism when I was maybe 21 or 22, when I realized that every time a journalist wrote about something that I knew intimately, they got the details wrong. And part of the reason is because they've been taught to do journalism. They haven't been taught the particular issue. The first time I really remember this was when I was taking classes in physics, and it had to do something with physics. And it was a column by James Kilpatrick, of all people, and he got stuff wrong. And no surprise, because he wasn't trained in physics. He was trained in journalism. And I mean, this is no grand problem to which I have a grand solution. Actually, there is another issue here, which is we see this sort of specialization everywhere, that you have engineers learn how to be engineers, but they don't learn how to be ethicists. And so an engineer can engineer a dreadful problem, creating mobile killing vans to kill Jews in the Nazi regime was a technical problem to be solved. And they started to solve it. They tried one iteration, and then they found that the people that the fluids released, as they said, which is they're defecating all over themselves and peeing as they are being killed, the fluids would accumulate. So they had to put in drains. That's step 2. So it was just an engineering problem. No ethics of should we do this. And we see the same thing with the creation of feller bunchers, the creation of drift nets. And we see the same thing in medicine. We can do things, should we do them? And then you have same specialization where you end up with philosophers. Don't even talk to me about ethicists, because ethicists then end up being philosophers who have no contact with the real world. And one of the examples I think of this is there was a ethicist philosopher who was arguing, this is 10, 15 years ago, who was arguing that if a woman is passed out and so she doesn't remember, it is actually ethical and utilitarian to rape her, because that will create greater good in the world, because the man will have an orgasm and the woman will not remember, so she will not suffer. This is insane. This is horrible. So even in ethics, they are separated from ethics. And so I guess, I mean, I don't know what the point of all this is, except to recognize how much specialization and division, how such very high specialization leads to, at the very least, mistakes, and can, in the case, I mean, I'm certainly not meaning to move from David Simon's The Deuce to mobile killing machines and suggest that there's some sort of slippery slope. I'm just saying that specialization, here's all I'm saying, specialization causes a lot of problems.